And welcome to our open access session. My name is Sarah Lavender, and I'm one of the research grants facilitators in Dalhousie Research Services. We helped organize this session today, but our Dal libraries are actually kind of taking the lead on this, and we'll be presenting the information that they are expert in. It is important to note, however, that Dalhousie Research Services is partnered with the library on initiatives around open access and data management planning, and we work collaboratively at all levels to figure out a good plan for Dalhousie going forward to meet the requirements for these two new initiatives, or fairly new. In the CIHR world, perhaps not as new, but certainly new for NSERC and SSHRC researchers. Just to the folks who are tuned in off-site, if you can enter your questions in the chat box that is on the left-hand side of your screen at the bottom, our speakers will be able to see your questions as we go, and we'll address those questions as they pop up. Just also so folks know, this is sort of the start of open access and data management planning outreach for Dalhousie. And the idea is that ourselves with the library will be trying to provide one session a month starting next month in more discipline-specific areas. So real issues can actually be talked about and discussed in terms of what's the best way to plan your data management, how can you meet open access and still maintain all of the things you need to around privacy and such things. So those are some of the things that we'll be touching on over the year, and so stay tuned to the DRS newsletter for event announcements. And from here, I'd like to introduce John Newhook, our AVP, who will say a few words from a higher level at Dalhousie Research Services on these initiatives.
Thank you, Sarah. I guess if I'm going to say from a higher level, I should stand on something higher. Many of you who have been preparing grants in the past year and a half, or are currently preparing one now for submission later this fall, have come across this issue. We are fortunate, I think, at Dalhousie that Donna Bourne-Tyson, our head librarian, and her staff have been tracking this for 3 years now, I think, maybe more, as the discussions started nationally. And while we don't have all the solutions, I think we've got a number of things that we're putting in place and continuing to develop that can be very helpful to researchers in addressing some of these requirements. And of course, the requirements are continuing to evolve, and we will continue to try to work with that. So I welcome everybody who's participating today, and we will have another session tomorrow as well that deals with the second aspect. So there's two aspects to concern yourself with this policy. One is the open access, which is how do you make your publications, your work accessible to others in the community in an open way. And then there's the data management. How do you manage the data? That's the background data behind your research in a similar manner. And so we've broken it up into two sessions. We'll deal with them separately. They can be linked, obviously, but they can be a bit unique in their solutions. So with that, I think, Sarah, you're up.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Stevenson, and I'm the Physical Sciences and Scholarly Communications Librarian for Dalhousie. And I'm sharing this presentation today with Jeff Brown. Jeff will be speaking a little bit later. Jeff is our Scholarly Communications Librarian for the University Libraries. So today's format, we want to keep it fairly relaxed. We did this session back in the summer with a small group, much like today. And so we've got about, half a dozen slides to go through and present some information, and then we're going to invite questions from you to discuss your particular situation. So if you didn't know, the tri-agency funders, CIHR, NSERC, and SSHRC, announced their policy on publications on February 27th last year. And basically, these are their objectives: to improve access to the results of agency-funded research, to increase the dissemination and exchange of research results. All researchers, regardless of funding support, are encouraged to adhere to this policy. So they're trying to get your research results out to the great wide world. The requirements: the grant recipients are required to ensure that any peer-reviewed journal publications arising from agency-supported research are freely accessible within 12 months of publication. And there's a few twists to that we'll talk about as the afternoon goes on. For the implementation dates, those of you that are CIHR funded, you're actually supposed to have been doing this since January 1st, 2008. And it's new for NSERC and SSHRC. NSERC and SSHRC grant holders after May 1st this year, the policy applies to them, although of course they're encouraged to make their work openly available prior to that. So there's two options that the tri-agency are encouraging to pass that they're recommending for open access. There's what's known as the green route, and these are online repositories. So they're subject-based disciplinary repositories. You can look those up through Open Door. There's also an institutional repository option. So most of the universities in Canada, including Dalhousie, provide an institutional repository. And here at Dal, it's called DalSpace, and it is managed by the libraries. So within DalSpace, we can set up a profile for you. We can add the citation information to your publication, and we can deposit a copyright compliant version of your publication. So if your journal allows you to deposit in an institutional repository, we can put the final published copy in. If they say, no, actually, we want our proprietary rights, you can't publish it in open access for the first 12 months, or you can only put in your preprint or your postprint and not the publisher's PDF. I have yet to meet a researcher that wants to put the preprint into anything public because that's your uncorrected copy. I'm getting some smiles from the audience that's actually here in the Tupper building, and that's the general reaction I get from researchers. Like, why would I do that? The postprint is also an option most of the time, and that is the corrected copy that you get back, but without the journal branding or the journal pagination. And we can take that and put that into DalSpace for you. There are some tricks. You need to look at your author agreement to see what you're allowed to do. We also have a tool that we use called Sherpa Romeo for looking up what the journal's publication policies generally are. So there are a couple of things that we can do to help mediate your open access publication. The other route is the gold route, and some journals allow immediate open access. Most of them charge a fee, okay? And some of those fees are quite substantial. We had a researcher here at Dalhousie that had a publication accepted into quite a prestigious nature journal, and the fee that they asked for was, let's say, substantial, and his department chair contacted me and said, do we have money for that? And I asked him which title he would like to cancel to enable this. That's because we're friends. I could say that, and he could laugh and say, okay, I guess we can't do this. So there are often author processing fees. In some cases, for some journal groups, for the Royal Society of Chemistry, as part of our subscription with them for their package, I get a certain number. As the chemistry specialist, I have authority on 7 vouchers a year for open access publications, and I'm monitoring who the Dalhousie researchers are that are publishing in Royal Society of Chemistry journals, and I've been handing out those vouchers over the years so that they can use them for the gold open access. So that's the quick review, the green route and the gold route, and I'm now going to turn things over to Jeff to pick up where I left off on author funds.
Thanks, Sarah. So I get to start with sort of a bit of a negative message about author funds. It's not so bad after all. Author funds are so clearly these mandates with open access are about changing the economic model for how we pay for journal content, right? That's what really this is all about. And so early on with open access, people noticed that the shift was coming and authors were being asked to pay. And so some of you may have come from institutions where your libraries had an author's fund to pay for your author processing charges. And early on, before these mandates sort of evolved, that was the option that a lot of authors were looking for. They would look to either their research office or their university library and say, we've been asked to pay now to publish in this journal. Do you have a fund for that? And we at Dalhousie do not have an author's fund, but we made the decision early on to support open access in a slightly different way. And what we did, we decided to support green open access. And so green open access, as Sarah sort of briefly described there, is when you make your article available through an institutional repository. So at that time, we thought we would get out in front of this, and we actually have an institutional repository where people can deposit their content. It's free for authors to use, and it's free for readers, and that's really important, right? So that's how we've decided to support open access. It's not that we're ignoring the gold side of things, but that's really where we put our resources. Of course, now it's emerged since these mandates have come in on stream that gold open access is in fact a claimable expense from your funding agency. So the need for an author fund is somewhat diminished, especially, well, obviously for people who are agency funded, then you don't need an author's fund from your research office or from your library. You can claim it now as part of your expense claiming. So that takes care of that side of things. But I will also say that if you do go the gold route and publish in an open access journal, that ought not to preclude you from depositing your content in a repository. And there's a really good reason for that. Journal publishing, journals go belly up, right? Journals fold. And we're really, since journals, we've noticed this in libraries for quite some time now, like 20 years. We've been asking, when journals went electronic, what happened was we've come to rely on them to preserve the scholarly record. Traditionally, in libraries, when we collected print journals, of course, that was our role. We preserved that content and we made it available to future scholars. So we feel we're best positioned to manage that even with electronic journals and even in an open access context. So if you do go the gold route, we still ask you to consider depositing your paper in a safe online repository. So we can do that too. So if you do, as I say, go the green route, it is important to recognize what's an acceptable repository, okay? And we do get a lot of questions about this because there's a lot of scholars on scholarly, what we sort of classify as scholarly social networking sites, right? So ResearchGate, academia.edu, SSRN even. These are places where scholars go to share what they're reading, to find out what their colleagues are reading, and to generally just network with their peer group. And they're great places, and we really encourage scholars to be in those places. But ultimately, the mission of those sites is not to preserve that content for long-term access that people are posting up there. So, and in fact, some sites will even allow publishers, I believe SSRN does this, to go in and charge a fee. So if you post up an article there and a publisher notices that it's their copyrighted material, they'll actually allow that platform provider to charge a fee for someone to view that content. So that sort of those are some things to look for when you're trying to, when you're considering a place to park your stuff online and you're trying to fulfill those agency requirements. You really have to look at the repository and the place online that you're hoping to put your content. And these types of places don't really satisfy the spirit of those mandates. So I thought I would flag that for you guys. And in addition, of course, tell you what does satisfy the requirements. And so there are very good disciplinary repositories out there. The physicists use archive.org, which has got a really long history. In fact, it predates most institutional repositories. So they collect physics papers. PubMed Central is another place for those in the health sciences. Your own funding, CIHR actively sort of recommends PubMed Central. So that is perfectly acceptable as a place to fulfill your open access deposit mandates. And of course, DalSpace, which we in the library manage. And the point that I want to make for you guys is just to look for the characteristics of the place that you want to deposit. So is it free to post and download the papers? If so, that's a good thing. No registration required to view or download. That's really important. Again, we don't want to be putting up barriers. Even if it's free, if you have to register, that's sort of a clue that this is not going to fulfill the mandate that the funding agencies have in mind. And of course, not owned by commercial enterprises. When a commercial interest gets involved in a repository, there might be other factors in play in terms of long-term preservation, right? So that's why we really promote our library service, because if we don't have a business model that requires making a profit from the site. But all of those social networking sites, I guarantee you, they're looking for an angle to make some money. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that at the end of the day, their overarching goal is not to preserve the scholarly record for future scholars, right? So it's just something to look out for. So as I say, the primary purpose, and it should be stated on whatever repository you choose, is to preserve and provide access. And that's all you're looking for in a repository that's acceptable. So Sarah, I believe, mentioned this. There's something called Open Door, DOAR. It stands for Directory of Open Access Repositories. It's a good starting place. If most people in your discipline or your academic community are depositing in a repository and you want to get your content in that place, go to Open Door, search it, see if it's listed, and then Open Door also indicates what the policies are for preservation and access and things like that. So Open Door is not a guarantee that the repository will be acceptable to your funders, but it's just a good starting point to have a look. So that's a bit on going the gold route. The other thing that sort of emerged as open access has grown is these things called predatory journals. And most academics, I think, have encountered a predatory journal at this point, I would say. These are journal operations that are really trying to take advantage of the changing nature of scholarly publishing, right? So they see a hook here and an angle. And so these journals, by and large, exist entirely for the purpose of collecting author processing charges, okay? That's really what they're about. And in fact, when you go to a predatory journal site and you start checking into them, one of the things they'll boast about the most is that they have quick article turnover times. Really, they're trying to really play on that need for quick publishing. So that's what they focus on. Now, that's not to say that low-quality journals and predatory journals, that's a gray area. I'm going to let this drill run its course here. They're right there. But probably we'll start again. Anyway, on people online, if you can indicate if you can't hear me if the drill starts again, I'll be happy to repeat anything that's said. And if you didn't hear that, there was just a large drill going on here in the building. So low-quality journals have always existed. They probably always will exist, but they're not the same as predatory journals. So that's the only point I want to make there. And a lot of open access journals are quite new. They don't have the advantage of a long-standing reputation. So I just also want to make the point that just because a journal is unheard of doesn't mean it's predatory. So there's a lot of misinformation going on about predatory journals. And it's something that's hitting people squarely in the face now, in the face of these open access mandates, because it's really got people worried about where do they publish. There's a lot of new journals out there, so what do they do about all this? So I just put together this slide this is an industry campaign. It's called Think, Check, Submit. It's a publishing industry campaign, and it's really just designed to provide a very simple framework to help people identify trustworthy journals. So in the sea of potential low-quality journals, excellent journals, and predatory journals, how do you decide who to publish with? So something I always tell people is, if a journal is stalking you, it's probably a predatory journal, right? So that's not a normal activity for most journals. They're not out there sending you robo emails and things like that. So that's just a good early sign that this is if a journal is stalking you, it's probably predatory. The other thing to do, scrutinize editorial boards, perhaps a little more than you might have done traditionally. So a lot of times you'll see an editorial board where there's no academic affiliation for the editors. That's something that should tip you off. A little more difficult to spot, of course, are fake affiliations, but certainly if you see something like an affiliation that just doesn't seem right, you should check into it. Also, be wary around a lack of clarity around those author processing charges that are at the heart of all of this, right? So if those policies aren't spelled out right on the journal website, that should be an alarm bell. Ensure that you can easily identify and contact the publisher, right? That should be clear right up front when you go to a journal site. Who's publishing this? Where's their office, right? That's always there for any decent journal. Look for false claims about where the journal is indexed, right? All of your favorite journals are normally, and that's a good just sort of second-tier editorial thing. You all probably use subject disciplinary indexes, and you have your favorite ones to go for, and it's sort of a mark of prestige for any journal to be indexed in the sort of index of note for that discipline. So if they're claiming that they're indexed there, go check it out. Only takes a few minutes. And then the other thing, which is a little more, sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's really obvious, is look for publisher names and journal titles where they sort of have these geographic references that really don't have any connection to the scope of the publisher, right? So the World Journal of Domination. If it's not about world domination, be wary. But you'll often see these sort of weird little juxtapositions of the International Journal of, and it's and it just doesn't seem right. That's an early clue. And so anyway, there's a website called thinkchecksubmit.org, and they provide a sort of a full sort of running framework of a few more things to tip people off on when they're deciding on a journal. So we had a lot more time booked for this afternoon, but really we just wanted to go through a couple of things with you guys. First of all, just to let you know, we know that you're being asked to deposit your content. We want to let you know the library has a repository. As Sarah mentioned, you do have to do a little legwork up front with your author agreements to make sure that when you do publish with a journal, that they do allow you to deposit that journal article in a repository. It's almost always there in the author agreement. If it's not, ask about it, okay? It's almost always clearly stated. And none of these journals are unaware of the fact that the funding agencies throughout North America and Europe and pretty much globally now are asking for these, that they're requiring their researchers to deposit and make their articles available open access. So it's not like this is going to be news to any publisher. If you don't see it in the author agreement, ask about it. And so we just want to let you know we have Dalspace for that, and then also with the predatory journals, if you do need help. The other thing, it's not just that sometimes even we in libraries have had predatory journals show up in some of our content that we're getting. So we'll have library vendors that are selling us sometimes thousands of journals, right? And so we can't vet every journal always in a detailed fashion like we would like to. And so if you do notice and you're checking through the library and you're saying, hey, this journal, I think this is a predatory journal, but the library is providing access, it must be good. Don't necessarily think that's the case. And in fact, if you notice something like that, because we had someone in the humanities last month point out that we think this is a predatory journal, but we noticed it's in one of the library databases, we'll investigate that, because what happens is sometimes the vendors aren't as rigorous as we would like them to be, and a journal sneaks through. So don't assume that because it's in a library database even, that it's locked down 100% a valid journal. We'll always follow up on those instances. So please let us know if you notice anything that just seems dodgy in terms of a journal that we're providing access to, and we'll try to get it out of all of our content, because we also don't want to be promoting those journals as well. So I think that's pretty much all we had to cover. Again, it's very brief, but we were hoping that maybe we could have a few questions either from the people online or from those of us here in person.
John.
I'll ask a fairly maybe generic question. I'm not currently using Dalspace as the green alternative. What do I do to start using that? What's the best? What are my steps?
So the question, in case it didn't come through on the microphone, the question was, I'm not using Dalspace yet, how do I get started? So there's a couple of things you can do. You can go to the library's website and search for Dalspace, and we do have a page on that about the Dalspace, but we also have an email address, dalspace@dal.ca. You send an email to that, and it goes to a whole bunch of people, including me and Jeff, and we will look at putting together a John Newhook page for you and getting your content up there and deposited. So that's how to get started with Dalspace.
So just to follow up to that, so if we provide you with like the CV of all the references, you would help upload that, or we would be responsible for providing it to you? Like, how does it work with, like, because each journal you said has a specific rule, so will you help us navigate that, or is that our responsibility?
We will help you navigate that.
Okay.
Do you want to repeat the question?
Oh, so yeah, so repeat the question. So the question was, if we were sent a CV, who does the copyright compliance checking? Does the research coordinator that is looking at me right now, or is it the libraries? We will work with you on that, and we're actually doing that with somebody, I can't remember the woman's name, in the Faculty of Health Professions right now. So we've given her the instructions of how to go through her health professional's CV and check for things. Our intention with DalSpace is that it be a repository, so we only want to upload citations for which there is going to be a paper attached. So, question in the back.
Follow up to that, so you don't publish just data sets then? If someone requires a data set to be published as part of a publication requirement for, say, PLOS 1, you're not publishing just data sets, you'll publish paper?
What we can do is put the citation to the paper in and add the data set to that. So yes, we can do the publishing of data sets.
But if the paper isn't accepted until the data set is published, how do we meet that?
Yeah, we can do that. We can. Jeff, you want to?
Yeah. So just to repeat the question for online participants, the question was around what if a researcher has a data set for a paper that is about to be published. It's not been accepted yet, but they do have the data set and would like to deposit it with us. Is that correct? With that?
Pretty well. I'm noticing, I'm a data manager, I'm not a person.
Okay, sure thing.
I have people who are coming to me saying they will publish my paper unless I give them a DOI for this data set.
Ah, yes. Yeah. So, and then the follow-up part of that question was, people are being asked to produce a DOI for a data set in advance of the paper being published. And we can absolutely help people with that. In fact, we've done it already. What we'll do is we'll put a placeholder citation in to the repository, and the Dal Libraries can assign. We're an official Crossref site, so we can assign DOIs to digital objects. We will assign that in addition to the handle, which is another persistent identifier that just goes on by default. But we can assign a DOI. We have a DOI prefix for Dalhousie, and then we'll put that up there, and then the researcher can contact the publisher and go, here's the DOI for my data set. Now you can have some assurance that the data set is available in a preservation environment with a persistent URL and is being managed. And then that should not be a stumbling block then for the publisher. There might be other stumbling blocks, but
I've also had to register with DataSite to get a DOI.
Oh, you've used DataSite, yeah.
Register myself, but follow up. What if my researcher's not at Dal?
The follow-up question was, what if the researcher is not at Dal? That also is not a particular problem. Dalhousie's repository is, we also do make the repository services available for any researcher who doesn't have a home for their research. And so we've put that on our DalSpace website as well. So within the region, we're sort of a repository of last resort. So we do actually fulfill that role within the region, and we will do that for unaffiliated researchers. If the researcher at some point then becomes affiliated with another institution, we would recommend that they move it to their institutional affiliation, and then we'll do all the back-end stuff to make sure that the DOI and the handle, in fact, reports to the directs users to the future location, because that's an important part of this, is consistent location for things, right?
So I'm with a network that's headquartered here, but we have researchers all over the world.
Yep.
So this is kind of what happens.
Yeah, I mean, and so if we thought that this was going to be a slippery slope and globally we might have a situation, that's why it's important to have a conversation with people as they're discussing. So we encourage anyone who is not sure if the repository will meet their needs or if we can help them out. We have a discussion, we'll look at the scale of things, and obviously we'll make sort of a common sense decision ultimately. So yeah, I mean, if we had hundreds or thousands of people, it might be a different answer. But of course, if there's only like a handful of people in this situation, we would of course be able to help you. Yeah.
Any other questions? NSERC did do a webinar this summer, and there is a recording of it available. We do have, through the Dal Libraries website, we have a subject guide for open access, and there is a link to that webinar. One of the questions that came up was one of the major journal publishers. After this, the tri-agency policy came out in February, they changed their policy for their publishing house to 24 months. A researcher had to put an embargo on open access deposit. And that question came up, and the response from NSERC and the people hosting was that they were well aware of this going on, that sometimes the publishers were trying to push out the embargoes past the agency funding requirements. And they are trying to work with them about that, and they're certainly aware of the situation. And some of you in the room may know the publishing house that I'm referring to. I'm not going to name them, but anyway, that is happening, and NSERC, CIHR, and SHRC are trying to work with those publishing houses, and they do know that it's an issue.
We have a similar issue with ecologically sensitive data, that there are embargoes of more than 12 months that are a pretty good idea for certain species that we track. So, yeah, but we've been talking with them about the same thing, where it makes sense. They can
Is there any other questions or comments? Anything from our online attendees?
Great. Well, thanks for those of you who attended in person and online. I've just popped up the last slide, which has contact